Hey there, everyone. Today I would like to discuss Deleuze's oft-cited and infamous essay, Postscript on Control Societies, which can be found in this collection, Negotiations. Very interesting and very short work, only 5 pages, and yet it is one of the most significant pieces that Deleuze has ever put together, and it's very interesting in terms of thinking about Deleuze's relationship to Foucault's work. And I think that there's a lot of very prophetic stuff going on in here, which is why it's so often cited. And I'd just like to kind of give you a summary of the kind of stuff that Deleuze is doing here. Now, in order to understand control societies, we need to understand Foucault's concept of disciplinary societies. Now, Deleuze kind of delimits the history of this in Foucault's work and what Foucault's goal was, but you can most accurately and succinctly find this in Discipline and Punish by Foucault, where he discusses the ways in which tactics for disciplining and punishing citizenry evolved over the course of European history, and in particular, he wants to look at a society which moves away from punishment to discipline, where discipline takes on a moralizing but almost justified lens, where disciplining is like a parent. You're disciplining, you're justly putting your kid back in line. It's a sort of moral education that's going on here. And Foucault tracks the way in which these disciplinary societies move away from their previous modes of, for example, public executions, public torturing sessions, and whatnot, and instead moves towards the development of prisons, for example. And instead of outcasting the mad or the criminal, they are tried to be reincorporated into society through the use of prisons and various other institutions, where institutions become centralized apparatuses to help kind of allow discipline to flow into the social milieu as a whole, such that we no longer have the sovereign operating from one point at the top of a hierarchy, but rather his or her authority is dispersed throughout the entirety of the social pyramid, such that the lowest levels are encouraged to, for example, permit the sovereign's authority to reign. Because one of the questions of sovereignty is, how do you get people to agree to your rules of the game? How do you create a political game which serves your needs? Hobbes understood this, that we're all vying for ourselves. We are all acting out of self-interest, which is different than selfishness because there's no value judgment behind this. It's just a fact that, if I step on your neck hard enough, you're going to do whatever you can to get my knee off from your neck. In the same way, Foucault understood that the sovereign was exercising this sort of tendency. And his goal was to try to get his constituents of the city which he ruled over to respect his authority. And at first it seemed that the best way to do this was through fear and trembling. But after a while, the veneer of justice went away when, for example, these public torturing sessions started to seem as if the sovereign was enacting the very crime that he was punishing. The murderer gets murdered, gets tortured to the nth degree. And eventually this turned these people who were tortured into martyrs. So disciplinary societies come around, and the goal is to code and delimit desires and thoughts themselves. It is to rearrange and designate subjectivity such that individual people will proliferate a sort of virus that is the sovereign's implicit authority. So disciplinary societies are going to be defined by their ability to designate a subject as a subject, to define what does it mean to be a citizen, a human being, a rational subject, a criminal, a madman, a reformer. All of these different terms are controlled by power relations. And Foucault saw this. As such, not only is subjectivity being designated, but we are delimiting spaces where subjectivity is going to be created, where we're going to have things like factories or the family unit or schools where subjectivity, through various strategies and tools and techniques, is going to be micromanaged. And by doing so, we constrain the likelihood that maybe the citizenry will revolt. And in so doing, we create a fixed binary between, for example, sovereign and ruled. And within a society, it has its own logic of what it means to be a sovereign and what it means to be ruled. And this essentially creates a relativistic, binary sort of corpuscule, which may use colonial means to expand itself or whatnot. But we have a notion of an internal logic which is limited by the element within the dialectic which has more power. This is the master of the Hegelian master-slave dialectic. But Deleuze wants to show how this form of disciplinary societies is something that has actually waned, and now we have entered a new mode, which is that of control societies. Now, as I mentioned with colonial imposition, the disciplinary society may try to expand itself by essentially operating against a periphery of outsiders. And the very existence of these outsiders define what it means to be inside. But something very strange happens when we get to control societies, where control societies are defined by controlling permissible permeability of a unitary autonomous mass. We could call this a simulacrum, to use Baudrillard's terms. Because if you think about a simulacrum, it no longer matters about there being an inside or an outside. There is an autonomous logic that indeed feeds off of a periphery, but a periphery which only exists qua subsumed. It's all about a global state of circulation, of statistical accounting for anomalies and incorporating them and coding them into a system, and it is multivalent. It actually allows for difference because it uses this difference to conflate itself into this controlling mass. And he explicitly mentions that control is the name proposed by Burroughs to characterize the new monster, and Foucault sees it fast approaching. He also mentions Paul Virilio. So there's lots of different angles by which he's reaching this. And in the subsection titled Logic, he says that the various placements or sites of confinement through which individuals pass are independent variables. We're supposed to start all over again each time, and although all these sites have a common language, it's analogical. So this is how disciplinary societies work, where we have little kind of micro units of the factory, the school, the family, the workplace, whatever it may be. All of these act as little micro emanations of power en masse. And each of these individual kind of localities has its own internal logic. And you operate in the family unit for a time in your day, and then you go to work and you operate in the factory. And all of these have a subject which essentially it doesn't matter what's happening outside of the factory. It only matters how one can constrain the behaviors relevant to factory work. So the factory is going to have some unique modes of authorization of subjectivity and whatnot, and the family unit is, and the school is, and all of these are kind of chipping away at people from different angles. And they're essentially autonomous, acting analogously to one another in terms of the way that they shape people. Now, Deleuze continues, the various forms of control, on the other hand, are inseparable variations forming a system of varying geometry whose language is digital, although not necessarily binary. Confinements are molds, different moldings, while controls are a modulation, like a self-transmuting molding, continually changing from one moment to the next, or like a sieve whose mesh varies from one point to another. So we have a very interesting thing. Not any longer do we have these separate localities with their own internal logic that have their own indifferent molds. But now all of these institutions start to blend together in one mass of universal modulation, where this information here reaches across the social network and becomes relevant to other institutions and whatnot, such that from the one moment to the next, one is constantly changing, one is constantly being primed, for example, to come from one milieu to the next, from one locality to the next. He says that control societies encourage a state of constant metastability, punctuated by ludicrous challenges, competitions, and seminars. And I think that's very interesting. This notion of continually punctuated challenges and competitions exactly describes neoliberal economics, where what controls economics is the needs of the market and the way by which competition will streamline things. So we have a logic, which is called the axiomatic of capital, as they call it in both Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus. This axiomatic is essentially simulacral. It no longer has to operate on something which has one milieu here, one milieu here, one milieu here, but rather it's all part of a common state of metastability, where everything is only relatively stable and is constantly moving and being altered statistically to try to account for any anomalies and maintain a sense of unitariness. He writes, "Factories formed individuals into a body of men for the joint convenience of a management that could monitor each component in this mass and trade unions that could mobilize mass resistance." This is disciplinary societies. So factories are trying to form this unitary mass, which is the workers. And they work for the joint convenience of management. So they act as one cohesive whole where the same measures are being applied to the entirety of the mass. Everyone is essentially being coded to be identical. And through this, not only do commodities become mass-produced and traded, but humans themselves are going between different job markets, but are essentially being beholden to very similar logics. But, he says, businesses, which is a paradigm of control for him, are constantly introducing an inexorable rivalry presented as healthy competition, a wonderful motivation that sets individuals against one another and sets itself up in each of them, dividing each within himself. And this sort of alienation is very different. It's pseudo-Marxian in a way, this being divided within himself. But it's not necessarily that one is alienated from their labor. It's that labor itself is an alienating process, trying to encourage competition within the subject. No longer are we trying to create a stable subject, but there is now a profitability from the liminal and chaotic internal state of the subject, him or herself, which is now put against itself, and it's treated as a healthy amount of competition. That, oh, the struggle is a sign that you're in the place that you need to be, that you have something that you need to be doing. If you're not feeling the hurt, then you're not doing the right job. And he somewhat prophetically mentions the way in which this is going to figure into the educational sphere, turning education into a business, as he puts it, which is exactly what we see today. Universities have become corporatized and whatnot, and now they are inextricably linked to business practices. He writes, "In disciplinary societies, you were always starting all over again. As you went from school to barracks, from barracks to factory," this is what we mentioned again, you're essentially starting from square one, where it doesn't matter what happens outside of the factory or the school or whatnot. Well, in control societies, you never finish anything. Business, training, and military service being coexisting metastable states of a single modulation, a sort of universal transmutation. And think about the increasingly globalistic nature of markets, where, for example, and he mentions this in this essay, labor is outsourced to third world countries, such that third world countries become inextricably linked to the market dynamics of more developed countries. And what happens here is every part of the globe becomes implicated in this growing economic mass, which becomes more and more diffuse, but through becoming diffuse becomes more unitary in a way, because it stretches further and further like a virus, which can code for different anomalies and actually incorporate them into a common system, where the notion of something being uncontacted or of a market that is essentially a virgin market, that's almost seen as an invitation, a reason why we need to expand more. So no longer does one finish anything because you're always focused on expansion. He says that control societies function with a third generation of machines, with information technology and computers, where the passive danger is noise and the active, piracy and viral contamination. And I think this notion of information technology and computers, of course, is something that he was well aware of. This was written in May of 1990, so computers are just kind of starting to really become a thing. The internet is either just come about or is coming about. I'm not exactly sure about the timeline of these things. But something interesting is that he talks about this passive versus active danger. The passive danger of noise is a void that is always threatening to eat one up, a sort of undifferentiated cellular death. Whereas the active risk is that you become contaminated by these great instruments of control, like a virus, that you have to become a pirate. He says that family, school, army, and factory are no longer so many analogous but different sites converging in an owner, whether the state or some private power, but transmutable or transformable coded configurations of a single business where the only people left are administrators. And you think about what the administrator does, they're sort of just pencil pushers in a way. They're pushing people from place to place, but the architecture is already in its place. The simulacral system is already in place, such that you do have this burgeoning system which has its own logic, which needs no outside. It is properly hyper-real in the Baudrillardian sense, where it is a copy without an original. He says that markets are won by taking control rather than by establishing a discipline, by fixing rates rather than by reducing costs, by transforming products rather than by specializing production. And this is very interesting that markets are, for example, when it comes to currencies, he mentions this, that the notion of currency, when we go off of the gold standard, control is based on floating exchange rates, modulations depending on a code, setting sample percentages for various currencies. So it doesn't matter if there's an independent notion of value anymore or some materiality to value. It's perfectly virtual, and it's floating in this metastable state where, if the stock market crashes, then suddenly money is worth nothing. And this is probably one of the most significant parts of this essay. He writes, marketing is now the instrument of social control and produces the arrogant breed who are our masters. Control is short-term and rapidly shifting, but at the same time continuous and unbounded, whereas discipline was long-term, infinite, and discontinuous. A man is no longer a man confined, but a man in debt. One thing, it's true, hasn't changed. Capitalism still keeps 3/4 of humanity in extreme poverty, too poor to have debts and too numerous to be confined. Control will have to deal not only with the vanishing frontiers, but with mushrooming shantytowns and ghettos. And ghettoization has become one of the most prominent discussions in urban studies today, and I think that Deleuze was very much aware of that. That no longer is the periphery something outside of society, but the periphery is coded and built into society, such that there is an internal ghetto which allows the society to sort of implode on itself and sort of undulate by having this mass that kind of crunches in and out and takes its own refuse, its own destruction, and uses that as a source for expansion. Such that now we are marketed too, right? Think about the prevalence of ads nowadays. You doubtless got an ad before you watched this video. Control operates through these little short-term tactics, which doesn't necessarily need to care for long-term longevity. It only needs to satisfy a role for the current system. And if the system changes, there are measures in place such that the system can alter itself. And that's the really scary part. He says that in control societies, everyone is in a permissible place and affecting a universal modulation. And that's interesting that we go from a designated place of controls or of disciplinary societies. Think of the panopticon, for example, where you have designated cells in which people are placed, which are essentially static. Instead, the cell now becomes the entirety of the world, in which we have a state of, as Paul Virilio calls it, habitable circulation, through which people are now in a permissible space. And permissibility is subject to change, but there's nothing inherent about a space being designated as proper. It is merely part of a global metastable regime. As such, Deleuze's writings here, brief as they may be, have been very influential in the state of critical theory and Deleuzean studies. Hopefully this has been helpful in kind of grasping some of the main ideas. There are certainly plenty of more things to talk about. You might check out Acid Horizon's discussion on societies of control. They have some very good things to say about these things, as always. That's it for this lecture. You can check out any of my other things that I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, and I'd appreciate anything you have to give, but no pressure whatsoever. That's it for this video, and I'll see you in another one.